are starting a series on the names of God. And if you're new with us, one of the things, obviously, we're a faith-based meeting, right? The focus is kind of looking at Scripture and not just going, hey, that sounds pretty good, that's probably some good stuff, right? The focus is to hear that and then go, okay, how does that apply to my life? What does that look like in our life, right? So who's ever teaching tries to do that, but then when we get into groups, start to think about that kind of stuff and say, hey, here's what stuck out to me. Here's what that looks like in my life. Here's how I can improve on that, because we know that healing comes from Christ. And I know that when we start to learn how to look at His Word and start to walk that out, look, I can testify all day long about that. I know about 1,000 other people that can too who have had radically changed lives because of that. We've tried everything else. So, trust us a little bit, give it a shot, even if it's uncomfortable, okay? Yeah, Zell's like, yep. All right, so the name of God that we are focusing on tonight is Jehovah Jireh. Jehovah Jireh, okay? And this is one of the many different names of God found in the Old Testament, but Jehovah Jireh is out of Genesis chapter 22, okay? Or Yahweh Jireh, all right? It essentially translates into the Lord will provide. All right, so just saying that is like, we can start to see that there's going to be some personal application here in our lives. The Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. Sometimes when you start to call on the names of God specifically, a name denotes the type of character, the type of person that is. And so when we say the Lord will provide, that describes God. He will provide for you in your time of need. All right? If y'all remember Genesis 22 or not, is everybody in here? Because I'm like, Genesis 22, not a clue, right? Until I look it up. And this is the story of Abraham and Isaac, okay? Has anybody heard of Abraham and Isaac? A couple of us. For those of you that haven't, this is where Abraham was told by God, like, hey, I want you to bring your son, by the way, who you waited like years and years and years to fulfill a promise that I made to you. You are so he's like the object of your affection. And I want you to get your son and bring him to this mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him. Essentially. Right? And you're like, the first time I read that, I was like, that's cruel, man. But what happens in the story is there's all this buildup coming throughout the whole several chapters in Genesis here. And then they get there, and the son starts to ask questions. I mean, he's like probably a young man. So he can fight back if he wants, right? I mean, Abraham's like over 100 years old, right? And he's even actually carrying the wood and stuff to his own sacrifice up a mountain. And he gets him right there, and then an angel of the Lord says, hey, stop. And right then, there's a ram caught in the thicket right there. And that's where the name, the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide in that time. The Lord provided a sacrifice in substitute, okay? And so this is kind of like a foreshadowing of the Lord will provide a sacrifice as a substitute for you in Jesus Christ. So as we kind of get into this, I started reading a little bit more about this, and when I look at these things, like you kind of read through a story and you're like, okay, what can I gain from this? What was this Abraham dude like? And he had a lot of stuff going on in his life, all right? But in this story, a couple of things stuck out to me. Number one, Abraham withheld nothing from the Lord. Like, he trusted the Lord with everything. He's like, look, if you say, I'm going to go do it. In this situation, think about how much it would take for any of us to be willing to get rid of or to bring to a sacrifice the object of our affection. Let alone a kid. Like a kid. On some days, maybe it's like, look, man, maybe you are going to the mountain. But on most days, there's not a chance, right? Abraham believed and he trusted that the Lord would provide, without a doubt. The New Testament actually tells us that Abraham believed God would raise his son from the dead. So here he is, believing that the Lord would provide. He's trusting that, like, look, this is on your terms, not mine. He's trusting that, like, God must have a purpose in this, even though I don't like this and I don't agree with it, but I'm going to follow it. And what ends up happening is he provides, right? He's sitting there thinking, like, well, I'm still going to have to kill my son, but I know what's going to happen. I'm going to kill him as proving kind of like my faith towards the Lord, and he's going to raise my son from the dead. Still, that's pretty brutal, right? And I was thinking through those things, and I was like, all right, so let's kind of look at Isaac here. Isaac, all right? Isaac was born of a free woman, okay? There is a whole lot of parallel lessons that we can learn from Isaac and Ishmael, okay? Both of them were sons of Abraham, okay? Born by two different mothers. Now, Isaac was born of a free woman. It's symbolizing freedom from the law and life. Why? Because this was God's ordained way of providing and fulfilling his covenant and his promise that he made to men. And I'm like, sounds pretty fair. I get it. Makes sense. But what you don't know, and you have to do some research on, is that Isaac and his wife, Sarah, waited 25 years for God to fulfill this promise that he made to them. Have you ever, waited on something from God? And then we start to get into the lesson. Ishmael was born of Hagar. Hagar was a slave. This symbolizes and is symbolizing bondage and slavery to the law. All right? Now, this is a whole bunch of biblical stuff that we're looking at. And it's like, how do we apply this to our life, right? Ishmael was Abraham and his wife's way of saying, okay, God made me a promise. I've now waited a decade. He must have meant something else. I'm going to go ahead and help this process along. Has anybody ever done that? Here's the way to go. Trust me. And you start walking down that path with all the joy in the world, and then you don't get it as quick as you want to, so you go we're going to speed this process along. How does that go? Yeah, it's usually really bad. Right? It's then it kind of takes a left turn, and there we are, right? So, here's the thing. When you start to look at this, I look at Isaac being God's way of fulfilling, and Ishmael being man's way of fulfilling. Okay? This is how we're going to do this. Even though God said we're going to do it this way. Right? And when you get into that, it's what is the lineage of both of them? If you look at Isaac, I look at that as the way of the Spirit, God's way. Ishmael, the way of the flesh. Right? Man's way. I can only see this, I'm going to do this. Now, the descendant of Isaac is Jesus Christ, which is also the provision for your sin, your death, your sacrifice, so that you can have what? Freedom from the law. Going all the way back to Isaac, born of a woman who was free, symbolizing freedom and life, freedom from the law, freedom from that kind of consequence, freedom from death, right? Ishmael, his descendant is Muhammad. Muhammad of Islam, symbolizing slavery and bondage to the law. All right? And we can see this even in our world today, the difference between when we're looking at Islam and Christianity. And we start to look at the splinter that happens once man decided to step in and say, Lord, I believe you, but it must not have heard you right. You probably wanted me to do this and help you in that. And then the breakdown that begins to happen, the consequence that begins to happen. All right? So, when we're looking at our life, we have to start to ask ourselves, like, even looking at this, the Lord will provide. In that time when we have temptation to say, okay, I believe this, but I think I should. When we start asking God to get on board with our plans, that's usually a big red flag. Okay? What I mean by this is the difference between choosing life and choosing death. A couple weeks ago we talked about Deuteronomy chapter 30, in which he said, today I lay before you life and death. Choose life. He's please choose life. Right? In order to choose life and peace, that means the way of the Spirit. When we start to see that in the book of Galatians, in the book of Romans, and all over the New Testament, he's like, if you choose the flesh, your way, you only get death. Bondage, slavery, addiction, those things. If you choose the way of the Spirit, if you walk in the ways of the Spirit, you get life and peace. It's always a choice. It's a simple choice. Why? Because people like me are hard-headed. And I need it to be easy. When we fast forward to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 13, it talks about, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it. This is what we were talking about. Way back with Abraham and Sarah saying, I think I need to help God out on this. Maybe I heard him wrong. See, he doesn't tempt you beyond what you're able. He doesn't allow, and when I say tempt, he doesn't allow that to come into your life. There's always a way out. The problem is it's usually not good enough for us. It usually isn't in the timing that we want. It's usually not on our terms. It's usually not fair to us. But because we don't see out as far as God, we don't see what he's doing in our life, because we want what we want and we want it now. I don't know how they waited 25 years for that. I can't wait 25 seconds for things sometimes. The temptation starts to come, maybe I need to hurry this along so we can get this done so I can move on with life. Wait a minute, sometimes the Lord has us in a time when we need to sit so that we can begin to see his provision. Because if you're moving 1,000,000 miles a second, you will never stop to see the people that God has provided in your life. The lessons on the daily that he has provided to grow you up strong, full of wisdom. Right? We have to learn to start to see these kinds of things. So, Jehovah Jireh is the name that we can call on. And that time, when we're tempted to just say, all right, you know what? I love going to church. I love all this other stuff. I like these group of people. They're nice, whatever. But now, I don't like that I have to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and do it my way. Right? I need those kind of mental cues. When I start to hear stuff going I think I'm going to start doing this, I can stop and say, Jehovah Jireh, I'm confirming, Lord, you will provide. Help me to trust you in this because I'm struggling. I want to do things in this way, but I want to trust your plans for my life. They're so much better than the way I figure things out. You see what I'm saying? Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. So when we get into groups tonight here in about a minute or two, a couple of questions I want you to think about, and I want you to talk about. Is there something that you know the Lord has provided in your life? Okay. Boast about it. It is good to remember these things, because It's the hardest thing in the world to remember when we're not getting what we want. And we feel like God's abandoned us. And maybe we're doing something wrong, okay? Talk about it. Say, you know what? The Lord's provided this in my life. It's very clear that He has. Or I think He's providing this. And number 2, is there something that you're waiting on Him to provide? And you're tempted to start looking elsewhere. Does that make sense? So what is the Lord providing in your life? And is there something that you're waiting on and you're tempted to go elsewhere for? Those are the questions I'd love. If you're one of these people that gets quiet in group, look, man, nothing leaves these doors. Please speak up. We'd love to hear from you. It's a good place to be. Nobody's going to throw a punch you. It'll be okay. All right? All right. Well, I'm going to